This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Dennis Koble was an early Atari employee, where he would become manager of both the computer and consumer divisions. He designed Atari's Touch Me handheld electronic game. He also wrote 3 programs that were published by Atari Program Exchange: Avalanche, which was an adaptation of the coin-op game of the same name, which he also created, and the text-adventure games Chinese Puzzle and Sultan's Palace. He was at Atari for about 4.5 years before leaving to co-found the video game publisher Imagic. There, he was perhaps best known for creating Atlantis for the Atari 2600, which we don't actually talk about in this interview. This interview took place on May 15th, 2018.
I guess, unlike most people I came to understand later in life, I always kind of knew what I wanted to do even as a very young age. And I had 2 choices. I was going to either be an architect or I was going to be an electrical engineer, without really knowing what that meant, at the time. So for me, it was always one or the other. And actually, I went, conventional high school. My dad moved around a lot, so I was always going to a new school, it seemed like. But as I got up to college age, I started off at Humboldt State. We were up in Eureka at the time.
I went to Humboldt State.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah. Journalism.
Okay. What was your background in there?
With journalism major.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
For me, it was math and physics. Okay. So at the time, they didn't have electrical engineering. You look like you might be a little younger than me, quite a bit, actually. So you're probably graduated a little later. But I didn't graduate from Humboldt State. I transferred over to. It was kind of an odd situation. All my friends in high school had foresight and I didn't, and they had all applied to a whole bunch of different colleges, and I all of a sudden woke up to the fact I hadn't applied anywhere. And so I got into Humboldt State because it was local. And then most of my friends had gone to Cal down at Berkeley, and so it was very easy at that time to transfer after 2 years. And so I did, and I transferred into Cal where I graduated. But I started off in architecture there and came to the conclusion fairly quickly that I guess I wasn't really cut out to be an architect. And so I switched over to my other love, which was electrical engineering, and also came to the conclusion pretty quickly that this really wasn't quite what I had in mind. But at that time, there was a very fledgling. I think what had happened is that Cal they had recognized computers were coming, and so they had their own computer science department in the electrical engineering group. But also the college recognized that computers were the coming thing, and so they had just literally started a new computer science major. And so I opted instead, since I was already in the electrical engineering department, I decided to go ahead and go with a computer science submajor. And that's how I graduated at Cal there with electrical engineering and computer science, kind of a dual major. And I went to work at a place called, at that time, there was an engineering recession. It was hard to get a job. But I ended up at a place in Palo Alto called Applied Technology, which was a defense company. And they did passive defense systems for the military. They basically weren't involved in active anything, they were amazingly involved in sensing things, and that sort of thing. So I worked there for about 4 years, 4.5, almost 5 years actually. And I had a friend who was working at this fledgling little company called Atari. And I had only vaguely heard of them. Nobody really had it at that point. And he said, well, why don't you come over? And he said, I can show you some fun stuff. And I said, well, I'm not really looking for a job. He said, oh, no, this isn't about a job. He said, I'm just want you to come and see what we're working on. So I went over there and they had these little spaceships flying around the screen, and I was absolutely hooked. I was enchanted because for 2 reasons. One it was astounding to me. Video wasn't that big of a deal at that point for computers. I still came from the punched card, paper tape era. And to see a little spaceship floating around the screen was something that was, to me, absolutely amazing. I couldn't even as an engineering major understand how that could possibly be. So anyway, long story short, they ended up making me an offer, a very handsome offer, and I went to work at Atari. They had actually been around for a number of years at that point, but I joined them right as the engineering group had split off into a separate building. Atari was in one building up to that point. They'd been around about 4 years, I believe. And so I went to work as a programmer there. And Mike Alba, who was another programmer there, he hired in about a week before I did. And Dave Shepard, who had only been there a few months, he was the second programmer, and the head of the group at that time was a guy by the name of Tom Hogue, I think his name was pronounced. And so we went to work there, and ultimately ended up working many years at Atari. And then I'll tell you a little bit about that more in a moment. But then I moved on to starting my own company with a number of other people called Imagic and so on and so forth, none of which is all that relevant to the computer thing. But we use computers to develop everything. Anyway, yeah, so as I was at Atari, I started off as a programmer. Atari was growing so fast you couldn't believe it in those years that I was there. They did have a good policy of hiring inside, at that time, except for their upper management. I think the week after I got there, then they had merged with Time Warner. Well, it wasn't Time Warner at the time; it was Warner. Bought them, and and then shortly after that, I think another year or two, that's when Time and bought Warner, and they all merged, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, they brought in some of their own executives at that time, and so they didn't really understand the business, gaming business certainly, or computer business, or anything about it, or that kind of entertainment. They knew about movies, obviously, but they didn't know about computers. They could see the promise, but they didn't know how to do it. So consequently, they did promote a lot from inside, and so I kind of, not through any desire of my own really, but I kind of moved up to several spots in the organization, and eventually I worked in coin-op for a couple of years. Then the consumer division started. And at that point, I went to work as the kind of the right-hand man for the guy who was running all that at the time. His name was George, and I can't remember the last name. It kind of escapes me at the moment. But what happened is that the place was exploding so fast, and my boss's real problem was he was an excellent technical guy and a nice guy and everything, but he didn't know how to play the corporate game. Not saying that I did, you understand, but he didn't click with upper management. And so they kind of looked for every reason they could to kind of get rid of him, really, as I think what really happened. I don't know all the inside details, but anyway, so very shortly I found myself as manager of both the computer and the consumer divisions, consumer being the VCS and the home game systems, and the computer being the fledgling Atari 400, 800. And sometime after that, one of the guys that worked for me, I went on a hiring spree. One of my strongest memories from being the manager there was hiring people, because that's all we were doing, was hiring people. They were desperate for people. And of course, it's not like you could go out into the marketplace and find somebody with home computer experience or somebody who knew how to do games or anything, So we were getting people from everybody from music majors to astronomers. Chris Crawford, for instance, his degree was in astronomy. All different kinds of people, actually. And some of them worked out and some of them didn't, but it was a very tumultuous time. And I ended up promoting one guy, Dale Yoakum, who was working for me. I think I had hired him, actually. And it quickly became apparent they needed to split off the consumer side of it versus the computer side of it. And so Dale was, I thought, my best choice to run that computer group. And so I recommended him, and he ended up becoming the manager of the computer division, and I was the manager of the consumer division. And but we were still, close associates and things like that. And so as time went by, we were all enchanted with 400, 800, even on the gaming side. I mean, we could see the potential for, future games on the computer. And at that time, there were games starting to appear on the various computer networks. The internet didn't exist per se at that point. There was the ARPANET and several other, fledgling kind of industry closed. They were closed to the public, but they were designed for researchers and things like that. But games started to appear on those. And so we were always on the computer, playing these games, and that was the era of CompuServe and things like that. We were all members of CompuServe and all these other networks. And so at some point, and I believe it was Chris Crawford and myself and Dale Yoakum, we decided a lot of people inside of Atari, even in the games group, were starting to write applications for the 400-800 because we were all enchanted with it. I mean, we thought it was absolutely amazing, And this was also when personal computers were just starting to come out, although they were not really going to come into their fore for another 3 or 4 years. But the 400-800, along with the very early versions of the Commodore and the Apple II, things like that, that's what we had available. And so the 400-800 was very advanced compared to most of those machines. And so we were all enchanted with it. I mean, it actually had color. It could do a lot of things. It had storage. All that sort of thing. So there was all these really interesting pieces of software that had started to appear. I actually ended up writing several of them myself, but I wasn't the only one by any means. There were tons of people there who wrote a lot of stuff, and some of it was very good. And so we three got together and basically formed the Atari Program Exchange, APX as it was called at the time.
Right. So was APX like your idea, or was it more of a consensus thing?
Well, I hesitate to say it was my idea, but it was certainly our group, Dale Yoakum, Chris Crawford, myself. For all I know, it could have been Chris's idea, and then he pitched it to me, and I thought it was a great idea, and I pitched it to Dale, or vice versa. Not sure who came up with the actual idea, but it was just a kind of a no-brainer if you think about it, because they were desperate for software. People were desperate for applications out there. There was really no commercial market to sell software for the 400-800. There was a few packages, and if you also remember that Atari 400-800 was the only system that didn't use Microsoft Basic at the time.
Right.
And so consequently, I remember making a trip up as kind of a junior management type with several other senior managers, and we went up to Seattle, and I got to meet a very young, Bill Gates and his cohorts up there. And he was trying to convince us to use the Atari, to replace the Atari Basic with the Microsoft Basic, and so on and so forth. None of which came to fruition, but I remember going up there and meeting him. And but anyway, so we took all the stuff that was, we had a very simple application procedure, and we offered royalties, which was kind of a new thing at the time. And we got an awful lot of good pieces of software. Some of the ones that are notable, I remember, are, like Lee Actor, his music, advanced music system. Yeah, which was a big hit, turns out. I didn't know Lee at the time, but that was, he was to become my partner later, and several ventures. So that was out there. There was a lot of really good stuff, actually. I did 3 or 4 games. I did one of the forerunners. I did a game called Avalanche, which was kind of later. Larry Kaplan did Kaboom, which was based on that. And I had actually it was a version of something that I had done earlier. And so consequently, I'd done an Atari 400-800 version of it. And so that was, one of the offerings. There was Chinese Puzzle Adventure, Sultan's Palace. I did a few adventures. Larry Kaplan had written a, quote, adventure system at that point, which was based on the old Scott Adams, or the Scott, I want to say Scott Adams.
Infocom.
But yeah, the original adventure. Mm-hmm. And so he had written a text-based adventure system where you could, by basically supplying databases, you could create your own adventure. And I was enchanted with that. So I created several adventures. It was kind of like a logic puzzle, and you basically plugged in the databases, and then these were the choices. It was a branching sort of database, sort of thing. There were several other really good products that were available in that APX. So
nice. So was a couple questions regarding that. I know Avalanche was also an arcade game. Did
I did that one.
Did that come before the Atari 800 version?
Timing wise, it would have been just slightly before, because I worked on I basically copied my original Avalanche code, converted it. I mean, they were both we had used 6502s in the arcade, a lot of the arcade machines at that time. When I first came to Atari, there was literally no computers used. I mean, Breakout was the very last of the non-computer games that were in an arcade form. And we were hired and brought in, myself and several others, to create games that were, going to be computer programmed. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine you could create these games prior to that in hardware, but that's what they did. And all TTL logic and things like that. People like Al Alcorn and all those guys that worked on that stuff they could create games. They could do marvelous things with circuitry that, later was easier to do with programming, and we could make changes and things like that. So that was the 6502 was kind of like after we experimented at the beginning with several processors in the arcade games, we settled on 6502, which then became the basis for doing the Atari 400, 800. And so consequently, it was pretty easy to port the code over, is really what I'm trying to say. Much easier because you didn't have to write these elaborate graphic routines. Even the arcade machines, they weren't as primitive as the VCS that came out later, but they were not totally trivial to program. I mean, people didn't have a lot of experience with how you would interface the graphics, hardware to the computers. That was still in development at that time, still where people were trying to figure that out, so. But it was pretty easy port, actually, as it turned out to be. But I added color, real color and stuff, whereas the arcade version was, I believe, black and white. And I think in some versions, they actually used colored cellophane for the various, rows of rocks and stuff like that.
It seemed like a lot of the your APX programs were among the very earliest ones in the first catalog. It seems like for those, someone was just like going around Atari going like, hey, we're doing APX, we've got to fill this catalog with software, what you got? Because some of it doesn't really seem like it was meant for the public.
It was, we were throwing spaghetti on the wall, let me tell you, trustfully. And that's the way Atari was during most of the time I worked there. Prior to that, I'd worked in coin-op, but I also, before I became manager of consumer, but I also spent a year working on electronic handhelds and, board games. Atari was trying to get into that business, and they ended up betting on a technology that didn't pan out for them. They wanted to put circuitry on cardboard, and the technology just didn't really exist to do that at the time. I'm not sure it does today, for that matter. But we created a whole series of board games and electronic board games, of which some of the prototypes are still floating around. You can find them on the internet. And then we did, of course, Touch Me, and which was ironic because Touch Me was a ripoff, obviously, of the Milton Bradley Simon. Mm-hmm. And the thing is everybody kind of remembers it that way, but that's not really what happened. What really happened is that Milton Bradley stole it from Atari originally. Yeah. It was an original Atari arcade game, prior to my time. It was an old non-computer game. And so they did and I have to hand it to them, they did a superb version with Simon, which obviously, as you know, sold millions. What's less known is we also sold millions of Touch Me because it was a cheaper price point. And I have to tell you, when you're young, especially, and you're a programmer or you're creating something, ever so often you're asked to do something that you find personally offensive. Okay. You tend to be idealistic, and you get on your high horse about various things. And they asked me to go ahead and create an electronic handheld of our version, Touch Me, Well, I didn't really want to do it. And so consequently, my form of protest is that I decided to make it identical to Simon. I mean, literally identical. The sounds and the inflection and the duration and every little thing that I could make the same as Simon, I did. So I'm not saying that's bad or good or I'm proud of it or anything else, but it was just my form of protest, because I was being asked to do something I really didn't agree with. I thought, geez, wait a minute, because I knew the real story, that Milton Bradley had ripped us off and
right.
so on and so forth. So that's how that came about.
Huh. So why didn't you want to do it?
It kind of offended me because we were doing, we like to do, I came from coin-op, okay? At coin-op, most people don't realize that, but in Atari, there were many factions as there are in a company of some size, and it got to be quite large near the end when I left. I mean, it was $5 billion and thousands of people at that point, but not so much earlier on, but it was still pretty large. And so consequently, the people that started it all, which were the coin-op people, okay, that were involved in that, they were very solid electronics guys, very solid computer guys. And for many, many years, literally for decades, they were considered to be the kind of the Cadillac of the industry in terms of coin-operated games. Their quality was one step up from everybody else's. They did a better job. They had better everything. And so consequently, we were always encouraged to be as original as possible. So in my mind, and I'm sure in a lot of other employees of that coin-op era, we didn't do rip-offs or copies. We just didn't. That was not in our psyche, in our genes. We were told to create original games, which we did. And it was relatively easy because nobody had done games up to that point, electronic games. So there was a huge, sort of infinite universe of things, game ideas and stuff. I mean, some were obvious, like the sports games. Those were always popular even from the beginning, to do an electronic version of basketball, but a video electronic version as opposed to the metal ones where the little things vibrated around the board. Right. Football's another one I can think of. Those were kind of obvious choices, but there were a lot of them that were less obvious. Warren Robinette's Adventure was really a groundbreaking game. There were a lot of them that were extremely good, but there was a rivalry between coin-op and consumer. Coin-op in general considered consumers to be the upstarts and the non-creative people and the less technical people, the less, competent people. And so initially, I guess that was kind of true because when consumers started, they ended up borrowing most of their game ideas. They were ports of arcade games. And so their mission and mandate wasn't to create original product. It was to create hopefully good renditions of existing arcade games that had been successful. So there was always this rivalry going on. And honestly, I was probably one of the very few people who was able to bridge that because I had spent 2.5 years in coin-op, had done some successful games. And then I came into consumer and I became a consumer guy, but at the same time, I was still collecting royalties from the coin-op group. So I had a lot of friends in coin-op too, and I still do actually, they're from that era. But so consequently, I found myself kind of straddling both of the divisions in a lot of ways. And we actually got to the point where we would trade employees for some period of time. We would take the guy who did Space Invaders, having a mental block right at the moment, but the consumer version, which was enormously popular, he actually took it up a step, from the coin-op, but we ended up trading him for one of the consumer, well, it actually turned out to be a woman. Again, I'm having a mental block on some of these names. You'll have to excuse me. It's been a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Carol Shaw. Carol Shaw, yes. She came over and did a cartridge because a lot of the consumer people or the coin-op people were interested in doing, seeing what it was like to do a VCS game and to, kind of see what it was like to be in the consumer market. She came over, she did this is not a record breaker by any means, but she did probably the most complete version of checkers I've ever seen at that time, at least certainly on a VCS. It was amazing. She incorporated many of the things that are happening professional checkers tournaments, things like that. We had a lot of good people. Brad Stewart, my right-hand guy at that time, was very good at what he did. There were a lot of good people. Rob Fulop, which you know the name, certainly from the games later. He and I eventually he was one of the guys that came over to Imagic, with me, and eventually made quite a name on his own. He had already made quite a bit of his name on his own up to that point, but he and I started the forerunner of PF Magic, which was the cats and the dogs thing, was for computers, which was quite a big success for their company later. And I was an investor in their company for a while. And so a lot of those people it's funny, you never know when it's happening, but those is a very special time. And I'm sure you've heard that from a lot of the other ex-Atari employees and people from that era. And it really is. I mean, a lot of those people are still friends of mine to this day. I interact with them on a regular basis. Lee Actor, who was never worked at Atari, surprisingly, but went to work later at Sente, which I joined sometime after Atari. He ended up becoming my business partner and friend, lifelong friend. To this day, I talk to him probably once a month, and he's become quite a fairly noted composer in his own right. And he's a conductor of orchestras, and he's also has got a growing catalog of compositions that are well received. He just got back from a trip from Turkey, for instance, where he did a tour of the country, and it was all state sponsored, by the Turkish government. And it was a big deal, He said he had a hard time getting used to being called maestro wherever he went. So we used to call him Lee, I mean, maestro is a little more formal. So anyway, I think it's sometimes, the memory can play tricks on you. I've learned that over the years. And sometimes, and another thing I've learned very emphatically is if you take 2 or 3 people that were at the same spot at the same time in the past, and you ask them to recollect a certain event, you will get 3 totally different versions. Mm-hmm. People selectively remember what is important to them or what struck them at the time,
Sure.
So I guess that's part of your job, is to interview a lot of people and to try to get many sides of one story sometimes.
Absolutely. So, I've done a lot of interviews, and the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yes, you're a wise man at this point. So anyway, so that was my, main, interest in computers. Although I would say that I was very interested in personal computers. And later when they came out, at Sente, for instance, which was a couple of years after Atari, we were very pioneering in terms of using, up to that point, people had basically used mainframes or larger computers like the digital equipment stuff, the PDP-11s and things like that. But later, when the personal computers came out, the first IBMs were pretty primitive, but when they got up to the AT class, the ATs were starting to get kind of powerful, the machines. And so we started using those for development because it was just cheaper. And it was more flexible, and there was all these people providing software and so on and so forth for it.
Nice. So I think while you were there at Atari, and maybe you were not involved with this decision, but in the beginning, in the early days of the computer, Atari held their technical information pretty close to the chest. They didn't want to release it, and then at some point, they changed their song. They released De Re Atari, and that caused, I think, as you know, a huge amount of new software to be released. Do you have any sense of why that shift happened, and were you involved in the decision to make De Re Atari a thing?
I wasn't directly involved in that decision. I think probably, let me tell you a quick little story and illustrate why. When I joined Atari, as I tell you, there were literally 30 people in engineering in the first little separate building away from the Atari. And in the main building where they did the manufacturing, it was, I don't know how many people were there, but it couldn't have been more than a couple hundred. When I got ready to leave about 5 years later, I remember going to a meeting. It still astounds me. It obviously stuck in my memory. I went to a management meeting, and it was over in Sunnyvale, where we had a whole cluster of buildings. Like I say, there were probably 5,000 employees at the time. And I went into this management meeting, and it was a huge room. It must have been a good, 40, 50 feet on a side. It was just a giant meeting room. And in that room, there was a huge U-shaped desk. And seated at that desk were, I would say, at least 70 to 100 quote, managers, directors, VPs, so on and so forth. And I remember sitting down, and Mike Moon was the president at that time. Ray Kassar was the CEO. And It was actually, I think the reason I remember it so well is it kind of crystallized my decision that Atari had changed dramatically from the place that I had, first joined and really loved and put a lot of heart and soul into. And it wasn't really the same place anymore. It had turned into a big corporate giant. And I remember sitting there and it came time to give me my, I gave my report, and that sort of thing. They kind of went around the table, which you can imagine took hours, literally. And so consequently, there were so many layers of management above me at that point, whatever I was doing at that point, that it was, I wasn't involved in those kinds of decisions. As to why they did that, I can tell you initially why they did it, which was that, Apple had always maintained a very closed environment system, and they were actually, it's funny, later they were to become a sister company to us when we later looked for funding from Imagic. Kleiner Perkins, which is one of our investors at the time, they also invested, I believe it was Kleiner Perkins, and invested in Apple. And so we were kind of sister companies. And I think I met Trip Hawkins very early on, although I was later to work at EA, as a director and several other things there, and got to know him a lot better. So it was kind of, I'm guessing they kind of looked at the very fledgling Apple, and there weren't too many computer manufacturers out there, I mean, really at that point. And I think they probably decided that they had a distinct hardware advantage, really, over these other people. And knowing Al Alcorn, who, again, is a longtime friend of mine, he and Joe DeCure, who was the designer of the 2600, and several other people there that were like the more senior management on the consumer side, they were excellent. These guys were really good. I mean, they were really good. Al was an excellent electrical engineer, and Joe DeCure, I just saw him like last year. He's not a personal friend of mine, but we're more business acquaintances over the years. But he still, I mean, these guys are brilliant. I mean, they're really smart guys, and that's the other thing that people liked about being back in those days of coin-op and computer days and consumer days was, the people that you saw at Atari were generally really, really good. I mean, they were not just your average, engineers, programmers, and stuff like that. There were some that were that way, of course, but there was a real elite crew of them that formed the basis really of Atari coin-op and later of consumer and of computer divisions that were really, really very sharp individuals. They were very good at what they did. And so that was a pleasure to be around people that were very competent, very goal-oriented, and smart as a whip, and all the other good things that go with that. So that was a draw for me, certainly. I think it's probably a draw for other people too. So,
sure. So I'd like to talk about why you left Atari, and I think I could guess at broad strokes and with things like overpaid prima donnas and how you were treated, but I would like to know why specifically you left, and about the founding of Imagic. And as a side question, I'm wondering, I know that Activision was started, I believe, in 1979, and Imagic was started in 1981, and similar companies in many ways. And I'm wondering if there was ever any thought for you to just join Activision, or to just have it be one mega awesome company.
Well, we were really never asked to join Activision, so that probably answers that question. Okay. I did know, I knew those guys. Well, I mainly knew Larry Kaplan because he had dabbled a little bit in coin-op prior to that. Okay, and I kind of knew him. But when I became the manager of that division, those guys had literally just left. I mean, literally like a week or two before I became manager, they let, not Chris Crawford, but the other guys, Bob Whitehead and Al, I'm having mental blocks on names today. And those guys had just formed, Activision. Mm-hmm. And, but we didn't think much about it one way or the other. They were the first spinoff, and we at Atari we were happy and everything, we didn't have any problems. But as I indicated in, that recollection of that management meeting, which occurred not long after that, I would imagine, it became apparent to me that this wasn't going the way that I wanted to go, and it was not. I didn't know anybody in that room, that I'm telling you about it. I mean, I knew a couple of people, but, it's not like they were one big family or anything. Whereas the people that I worked with, I won't say they were one big family. Well, they probably were because they swallowed a lot. But, they were family. They were people that you worked with every day. They were people you respected, all that sort of thing. And all of that wasn't true anymore, And so for me, I said, okay, I actually came up with the idea for not Imagic, but its predecessor, which was I was looking for something different. And so I said, well, look, Atari's been good to me, and they had been very good to me. Okay, I didn't have any beef against Atari at that time. And I said, well, what I think I'm going to do is I said, I'm going to go ahead and ask Atari to fund a small group. Probably in Santa Cruz is what I was thinking at the time. Maybe 4 or 5 people. I'll head it up, and we will go off, and we'll be like the old Lockheed term, skunk works, or whatever you want to call it. And we'll go off and do some innovative things, and we can have that small group and still have the backing and the funding and the marketing might of Atari behind it. So I was going to do that. So I started writing up a business plan. I wrote up an extensive business plan. And I got to the section on marketing and sales. And I realized I knew nothing about marketing and sales, zero. Okay. I mean, I was a technical guy my whole life. My degrees were in math, physics, electrical engineering, computer science, that sort of thing. So anyway, I said, well, who do I know that knows anything about marketing? Well, at that time, Bill Grubb was he was the VP of marketing at Atari. And I said, well, I kind of knew Bill. He wasn't a good friend, but I kind of knew him. I'd seen him in management meetings at smaller meetings because, he was one of the few people that I would see regularly. And so I called him up one night and I said, well, Bill, I explained it, and I'm explaining it all to him. And I said, I realized, and I got to marketing, and I realized I don't know anything. I was wondering if you could give me a few tips and give me some ideas here as to what to write, this business plan. So we're talking and talking. It was ended up being like a 3-hour phone call. And about halfway through, Bill says to me, he says, well, Dennis, he says, why are you doing this through Atari? And I go, well, I didn't really have a good solid answer. I said, well, they've been good to me. They have money. They know what they're doing, so on and so forth. And Bill says, we need to talk about this. He says, I think we could split this off into a regular company. And so one thing led to another. He had a good friend who was a lawyer. And we got together, he and I and this lawyer, and we said, well, maybe we should go out and look for some money. And we also had the other guy in the foursome there was Brian Dogger. And he had come from Mattel, and Bill knew him. And so Bill asked both Brian and myself to, think about people that you might want to hire from your respective groups, into a new company. And so I came up with names like Bob Smith and Rob Fulop and, people like that. Brian came up with several people, Jim Goldberger, who was a kind of a marketing guy. He knew several programmers that he thought would be really good. Brian was a good programmer himself, actually. So anyway, we went out there, and it literally took us, from the moment that we first had that phone call, it took us less than, I believe, memory serves me, about 2.5 weeks. We basically ended up making about 3 or 4 pitches to the various VCs, and they were competing with each other, and boom, we had like $2.5 million or whatever it was, which was a huge sum at the time. And boom, there we go. And the guy that came up with the name for the company was one of the Mattel hires. He was a kind of a slightly more junior guy than the rest of them, but he was a programmer. His name was Chan. Again, mental block. So you're going to have to fill in the blanks here a little bit. But he actually came up with the name because we got together in one brainstorming group, and everybody was throwing out pitching names for the company and everything. And Gary something.
Okay.
Yes, that's probably it. He's listed as one of the founders of Imagic. And he came up, he's the guy who actually came up with the name Imagic. which was a great name. I mean, it's really still, if you've ever tried to do this on your own, you'll realize quickly how hard it is to come up with a decent name, original name for a company. It's not trivial at all. So anyway, he came up with that, and boom, we were off and running. That's how it started. So Brian hired the people that he knew at Mattel. I hired the people that I wanted to bring over from Atari, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Sure.
We were on a meteoric rise, but we knew all the guys at Activision. They knew all of Seth. We had a bit of a rivalry with them because they were very technologically solid guys there. I mean, really, really good. I mean, those four guys were all technical, giants. They really were. But we were pretty good too. So when at our first CES, where we first showed our products, which was way in advance, so we weren't supposed to do that until the next CES or 6 months down the line from there or whatever it was. And so consequently, it was kind of, we had to show our best stuff. And we wanted to show technological tricks that we figured that the Activision guys hadn't seen before. And I don't know if they felt that rivalry toward us at that point, but it became a rivalry a little later. It really did. They were always coming out with some new things. And then I think Bob Smith came up with a 5 moving thing kernel that he had written, which was kind of unusual at the time. You can only usually move something like 3 or 4 objects on a line, but he could move 5 objects on a line, and so on and so forth. And so there was this kind of like intercompany, but it was a friendly rivalness, between us. And that's kind of how, Imagic got started and kept going really along the way. And then we did some deals along the way too. Bill was very good at, Bill took a lot of heat when the company Imagic finally went under, but especially from the employees, but I actually was fairly impressed with Bill's marketing ability. He knew a lot of people, and he cut us a deal about at that time, a couple of years in, maybe it was only a year or so in, Ralph Bayer, Magnavox, they started suing everybody because they held very key patents, that kind of governed a lot of modern video gaming at that point. And so consequently, but Bill knew the people at Magnavox, and he maybe not have met Ralph Bayer directly, but he knew of Ralph Bayer, and Ralph Bayer quickly became appraised to Bill. We sat down with him, cut an extremely favorable deal with Imagic, way better than anybody else got, as far as I know. So I think Bill was really pretty good. He was very good at promoting the company. I went with him on several, marketing trips, everywhere really across the America and the globe, really. And he kind of reminded me of, quite frankly, a young Jack Kennedy in a lot of ways. He had a kind of a similar New York look about him, and, or a Boston type New York look, East Coast look, we'll call it. And he grew up in New York, or it might have been Boston. No, it was New York, actually. His dad was a New York policeman, as I recall. And he had that sort of sensibility that he knew how to speak to the business world back east, the corporate types and everything. And so I was fairly impressed with Bill. And I think these days he's retired, living somewhere in South Carolina or something. I'm a friend of his on Facebook, but he doesn't post much, and neither do I. So, I can't say I maintain the friendship or anything, but I always thought he was a good guy. And so anyway, yeah, that was really kind of the story of Imagic. And of course, what happened is that, this is pure hearsay at this point, but when the video market collapsed, basically, a lot of the excesses really occurred after I left and stuff. I'm not going to say that me leaving caused the excesses by any means, but it was really a question of growing too fast, too large, too fast. It really was. And consequently, some of the moves to manage the programmers were so ill-considered, really, looking back on it, especially, they basically showered him with money and adulation and praise, which is good, I guess, but I think they kind of overdid it. And, some of the stories later, I'm sure you've heard some of those about Todd Fry and Howard Warshaw, who was a guy I hired from HP. Yeah. A very sharp guy, still is to this day. I just saw him just last year too. He's kind of a friend, as is Todd. I've kind of kept in touch with them over the years. they were basically that all bad stuff that you hear about, or some of the excesses you hear about, kind of occurred after I'd left, really, and Atari just was out of control. Upper management didn't know what to do. They had, these were guys that had marketing at RJ Reynolds, they had marketing at P&G. They didn't know how to deal with technical companies and programmers and engineers and stuff like that, and so consequently, the marriage didn't go real well. That's really what it comes down to. And, all they were concerned about as far as the engineering groups were and the programming groups was getting a product out in time for Christmas, which was always had been the motivation at Atari. But it kind of got to the point where they had no concept of what it took to make that happen. And so they overpromised. They built too many things. You know what happened? Flooded the market, the old ET fiasco, all the rest. Howard got paid a ton of money to do that. But the fact of the matter is he got something like 2 months or 2.5 months to do it, or some ridiculously short period of time, 10 weeks, I think it was. Yeah. And the guy could have been, he could have been Gandhi or something. I mean, he couldn't accomplish that. He was good, but nobody's that good. So, there were a lot of things that happened, and a lot of people feel, and I don't want to necessarily say this was the case because I really don't know, but a lot of people feel that Atari's announcement was designed to coincide with our public offering at Imagic and an attempt to harm it, which it did. It basically ended up killing, that public offering. I look back at it in a slightly different way probably than most people. I have to tell you, we were all in Imagic. We also experienced a lot of success very fast. But the guys that I had working for me, at least, and I think in the rest of the company, were much more mature than the people, at that time at Atari. They were a younger crowd, and these people were all. I don't think any of them were ever harmed by it by any means. But when I remember literally right before the offering, we were looking at homes, and we went to, I think it was Saratoga, someplace in Saratoga, one of the higher end communities. And we were looking at homes at that time as possible homes to buy. And all I really remember from that period was my wife and I arguing every day. Oh, that house is it. Oh, we should do this. Oh, no, we shouldn't do that. And it was all about money and getting the right status symbols and all the rest of it. I don't remember that being a happy time. Mm-hmm. So when the bottom dropped out of the whole video games business, I can't say as it particularly bothered me. I mean, it was like too much. It was, it's like the Dutch tulip market back in the 1600s or something. It was just too much. And of course, quality went to hell, especially as tons of other companies started entering the business. And the retailers, they just, everybody shed a tear recently for Toys R Us going out of business, but Toys R Us they were a ruthless retailer back in those days. I mean, you shipped them product, they put it on the shelves. If it didn't sell, they sent it back at your expense, and tough. That's just the way it was, and they were the number one retailer at that time for video games at that juncture in time. Computer Starts really hadn't started up yet or anything like that. Certainly there wasn't any online stuff or very little of it, but because, the internet wasn't what it is today. So it was very important, those retailers, at that time. And the thing is that it was just, I can't say as I was really unhappy when the whole thing crashed. I mean, there was a lot of fallout. We all went through some periods of recovery, and trying to find other, I remember going out and looking for some other lines of work. I actually worked for a subsidiary of Grid Computer for a short time, just working on a operating system and the various applications and stuff that were going to go into the Grid Computer. Well, of course, we went bankrupt, and then a month or two later, Grid went bankrupt. So what happened to that too along the line. So I found myself coming back to video games eventually, and that seemed to be where my expertise was, and certainly my interest was, and everything. And so that's how I continued on to tons of other companies over the years. I was fortunate that I had some good friends that had been working at a little startup called Sente Technologies at the time, which was funded by Nolan Bushnell. He was the CEO. And they were then subsequently purchased. As a matter of fact, the week before I went to work there, they were purchased by Bally Manufacturing in Chicago. So it became Bally Sente. And originally it even had a different name, which I can't remember right now. But those were all, Sente was all ex-Atari coin-op people, basically. And so I was again among friends in a comfortable environment. I mean, Ed Rotberg, Roger Hector, Howard Delman, lots of people were there. Owen Rubin, joined up, a little time after I was there. But there was tons of other people there. We ended up, I think, at our peak, we had around 60 to 70 people. And we were doing kits, the Sente system at that time, which basically was a way for the operators not to have to pay for the brick and mortar part of a game, the monitor and the power supplies and the cabinets and everything. You just take a Sente's kit,
swap out the guts,
and control panel, do control board, and that was it. You're ready to go. Basically some new graphics. So they had a fairly successful, but again a tumultuous run over the times. But that's something that we were all used to that by that point. I mean, we'd all been through the ups and the downs, and that, for all I know, is probably still true today. You still see certain game studios go out of business on a regular basis, and, ones that can't meet their schedule, or they're mismanaged, or there's not enough money, or blah, 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 all the reasons. So we got used to most of the people that survived that era, of which there were quite a number, learned to kind of roll with bunches, I guess is the way to put it. I mean, the company went out of business. Okay, we've got to go do something else, and it wasn't like a catastrophic event. It wasn't like, oh, all my possessions had been, washed away in a flood or something. It wasn't like that at all, or my life is ruined. No, not really. Right. We were all pretty young and resilient and went on to other things, sort of things. So.
Sure. How do you spend your time today?
Well, I'm retired these days, pretty much. I kind of semi-retired many years ago, but I built a home up in Nevada City, was kind of lured up there by a couple of ex-Atari guys again. Ed Rotberg, of course, I mentioned already. He was living up there along with Rich Adam, who had done a couple of arcade games and was also a friend. I remember looking all over California at the time for a place to retire and to build our quote dream home. But Rich, I was on the phone with Rich one day, and he said, well, why don't you consider coming up to Nevada City? He says, it might just be what you're looking for. So I went up there, and sure enough, it was what I was looking for. So we built a big home up there. And then they had a fledgling company, which went through many, many different name changes, but it was called Mineshaft Entertainment in the main. And they were a subsidiary, or kind of a captive subsidiary of a couple of companies, actually. I'm trying to remember the main company. I don't think it was THQ, but it was somebody prior to THQ, that eventually became THQ. And we were doing ports of games for them up there. So I joined them as a programmer, and although I think my title was director, but it was mainly programming. We were a very small company, 7, 8 people. Something which I always found myself continually drawn back to, the small little group of under 10 people. You knew everybody knew you. If the trash bin needed emptying, whoever happened to be nearest it picked it up and emptied it. It wasn't like we had well-defined, rigid job roles or anything like that, So rode that thing for a while, sold that place just last year and moved down here closer to Sacramento, where our daughter lives. And these days, I spend most of my days on the computer, probably a good 8 to 10 hours a day on the computer. I mainly play games, believe it or not, to this day.
What do you play? What's your go-to?
Okay. Well, I'm a lifelong MMORG player from the very early days, back in Apple II days even, and even the ARPANET days, So I always had an affinity for those kinds of games. So for me, I got early on into EverQuest and became a real EverQuest fan for many, many years. This is back in dial-up days. And then when EverQuest 2 came along, I became a real fan of EverQuest 2 and played that for years, literally, again, through the dial-up era and then eventually into the modern internet era. And then I got hooked on Rift for several years, played Rift for quite a number of years, really enjoyed that. And lately, unfortunately, EverQuest 2 is kind of headed downhill these days. They're a shrinking, player base at this point. The company that bought them from Sony is a place called Daybreak Entertainment. They actually have many titles that they, sell and manage, but they're, I hesitate to say that they're a bottom feeder, but they're not like the old Atari of old or anything like that. They're more bottom line kind of people. I believe they're Chinese. I believe they're Chinese investors that, investment group that owns it. And so consequently, I found myself increasingly playing Guild Wars 2. I had tried the original Guild Wars a few years ago and found it okay. Didn't care that much for it. But my daughter got really heavily into it about a year or two ago, and she kept imploring me to try. Then she's dad has changed, blah, blah, blah. So I've been starting to play it, and I've got to say I'm playing it pretty heavily at this point. So Guild Wars 2 is my latest one. But I play all the games. I was a huge Doom. What was it? Doom 2016, 2017. That game, I played that way all the way through the end. I love that game. God, that was so well done. Fallout 4, Assassin's Creed. I haven't bought the latest Origins, but I really am very interested in playing that's the latest version in that, that enduring franchise. I was a big early on, Tomb Raider fan, although I didn't care too much for the later games, but I played all kinds over the years. The only thing I'm not a big real fan of is sports games in particular. But I like shooters. I like every other kind of game. I like driving games, you name it. So I play a lot of games, trust me. And then I do music production. That's the other thing. I've been always interested. There's a classic example of having the interest but not the ability. From a very early age, and I mean as a childhood, I was always interested in music. I'm sure you've heard that from many people. I literally took lessons for years to play the piano, to play the violin, to various things, and I was always a miserable failure at it. I mean, I got to qualify that. I mean, I had a certain level of competence, but it was pretty clear to me after a couple, 3 years on any of those instruments that I was never going to be a quote musician. I mean, I didn't have the dexterity, the manual dexterity you needed, so on and so forth. So time passed, and I was, busy with my career. And then these things came out a few years called these digital audio workstations. They're called DAWs. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are out there. The main one today of choice, there's 2 or 3, but Ableton is one of the main digital audio workstations. There's, of course, ProLogic. There's a bunch of others that are equally as popular, depending on whether you're on Mac or PC. And what you use these things for is to create music. And so I kind of got into that. To me, it was a revelation because now I didn't need to be a, quote, musician to produce music or to compose music. And so I've been heavily involved with those for many years. I wish I could tell you I'm as good a composer as I was a game designer or something, but unfortunately not. I think I'm okay, but, and I've actually had 4 albums, I think, out there over the years that have done okay, but you're not going to find me on any top 10 charts or anything like that. It's one of the things that's been something that I've never heavily gotten into. Although the last little record company, I put out an album a couple of years ago through a little record company in Seattle that was, did an album, and it was fairly successful. But they kept trying to draw me into the social media age, And I admit I do check Facebook on a regular basis and do other things, but I'm not into the social media in general. And I don't have a Twitter account I'm not into all the other things, that are available for social media interaction. They kept trying to get me involved in that. And I'm basically an engineer nerd at heart. I'm happiest when I'm working alone on my computer, staring at a computer screen, doing whatever I'm doing. Having some like-minded and very competent people around me to help me when I have a question or I need to understand something a little better or whatever. And to get some feedback from, and hopefully vice versa for them too. So for me, that's where I'm happiest. So, and I think this has probably been true of a number of, quote, even A-listers these days, musicians and composers, and well, even they call them performers anymore. People like Katy Perry and all the rest of them that are enormously successful. Don't get me wrong. They do wonderful stuff, but they don't have time to be composing songs they started off that way. They're competent at instruments and composing, but they don't do any of that stuff these days. Bruno Mars, he's not going to be sitting down playing the piano or composing a tune in general. You can just go through the whole list of them. These are, performers and they're really good at that. Really, really good at that. Ariana Grande, what a marvelous voice. Just truly marvelous. If you kind of get past the pop thing, she's got a wonderful voice, but she's a performer, So other than those people, I think there's probably quite a number of people in the entertainment businesses that don't really care to be out there, that care to be out in front of the crowd and promoting themselves on social media, which you absolutely need to do these days, or be on the concert path, the tour. Well, not only am I too old for that at this point, I wouldn't feel real comfortable being up there being a DJ at a big EDM concert, although that's my fantasy. But I wouldn't feel real comfortable doing that. I don't, as you can tell, I'm obviously very, I'm socially pretty comfortable compared to some people in our business and stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm not it was never been my goal to be famous. Let's put it that way. I had never been interested in being famous. My fantasy was always to be the person in the background, just to the right of the throne, that was getting a lot of the benefits and reaping a lot of rewards of being famous, but nobody knew who I was. That was always my goal, to be that way. And you can't do that. If you want to be successful these days, you have to be upfront. You have to be out there. You have to be comfortable with doing that. You take somebody like a Calvin Harris or I don't know, any of them. I'm kind of avoiding the music performers. I'm thinking of more of the people who actually create music, like a lot of the EDM producers and the electronic music producers. I'm sure a certain amount of them don't really care to be out there DJing, but you have to do it. You have to have maybe if you're big enough and successful enough, you have a team, a social media team, which we have a small one at the little record company in Seattle. And they did have a Twitter account in my name and a bunch of other things, but I'm not all that comfortable with that personally. So I'm happy just sitting here right now, my keyboard in front of me, I've got my Ableton, I've got my SoundForge, I've got all my stuff, here, I have gigabytes worth of musical loops and sounds and to play with and to do all sorts of things. And that's how I really spend most of my time these days, between that and games.
Nice. So, but you occasionally go to the classic gaming shows like Portland Retro Gaming Expo. I know you said you don't want to be famous, but you go in that environment, you're a little famous.
Yeah, you do. You have to learn to kind of, but usually it's more of a one-on-one kind of a thing. When I went to that show, I missed it this last year because we were in the process of moving, but the prior year I was there. And, I won't lie to you. I'll say it is gratifying to have people come up and recognize you or to ask for your autograph or to have them tell you a story. They want you to tell them a story about something or some information that they're interested in. But I will say this, these shows have astounded me over the years. The one 2 years ago, and I don't know about this one last October or November, but the one prior to that, it had an attendance of 22,000 people, which blew me away. Blew me away. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that most of them didn't know who I was or anything. They were a younger generation of gamers. And for them, classic gaming is the Nintendo arcade machine or the Nintendo 8-bit or earlier PC games or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
It's Xbox, the original Xbox, the original
PlayStation,
PlayStation, all those kinds of things. So of those 22,000 people, honestly, 21,500 of them probably, they weren't there to see me or anybody like me or anybody from my generation, in gaming. But I think it's really nice. I have to really compliment the show's organizers. That particular one, Rick, of course, mental block again here on the name, but he invited us. He's one of the guys on the board of directors there. And they really did show us they provided a venue for people who were interested. And there were actually hundreds of people that were interested. in what it was like back at the beginning of creating games and that sort of thing. And they want to know stories. They're, as you are probably aware, no matter what you're interested in, there's people in the world that are interested in that also. And a lot of these, quote, we'll call them fans because they really are, they're obsessive. They want to know stuff that you can't imagine anybody would be interested in, but they are interested in it. They're passionately interested in it, which is interesting in its own right. So I gave a couple of 3 talks, and the people and of course I ran into a whole bunch of ex-Atari people that year. Happened, Howard Warshaw was there, Todd Fry was there, Bob Smith, an old friend of mine, from Atari Imagic days, was there. Give me an interesting little tidbit about him. He was a shipbuilder before he came to Atari. He worked at a lumber mill. He was doing a business system for a lumber mill. These people came from all sorts of backgrounds. And it was kind of fun it was a little bit like old Atari Home Week there, with the people there. But it was also fun to meet the fans and to people that were interested in stuff like that. You go into their museum of video game antiquities and, to see walls of games of which you actually created a few of them here and there, or your buddy here has created several more of those and stuff. It's thrilling, it's pretty thrilling. I will say that, but it's also tiring, as you can imagine.
Yeah. It's tiring for me to go to that show and I'm just walking around looking at stuff, buying stuff.
Yeah. Let me ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
How was the attendance this last October, November? Was it pretty good?
It looked crowded. I was only there for like 2 hours. I had family issues and I really couldn't enjoy myself there, but it was crowded as ever and seemed to be, it was hopping. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I kind of hope to go back this coming October, November again. I really enjoyed that show. I've been in a number of them over the years, and the original guys, the original show guys, Bob Hart, John Hardy and the crew down there. They have the video game museum down in Texas these days. I went to a number of their early shows
in Vegas.
Yeah,
CG Expo.
Yeah, exactly. And we always, you probably shouldn't pass this on, but in the know, we always called it the Old Geezers Convention because it was, we're all getting old. Let's face it. And this was they would have official names like the Classic Gaming Convention or the Vintage Gaming Convention.
Right.
We'd always call it the Old Geezers Convention.
Just so you know, I'm not editing that out. That's great.
It's kind of funny. Well, we're getting up there. There's no question about it.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
We all are. You mentioned Bob Smith a couple times, and I have interviewed him, and it was a great interview that I did in 2016. But one of the quotes that I pulled out from it was he said, "I had 2 kids, no degree. I walked into Atari and said, I wrote a game and sold it. Want to hire me?" And
that's basically true. Well, that wasn't really
and Dennis Koble did, and that was that. Yep.
I'm going to tell you a secret, something I've never told anybody. Okay, here's your exclusive on this interview.
I'm ready.
The reason I hired Bob Smith, at that time, he was working at a lumber mill in Southern Oregon. He was designing working on their payroll package, I believe, or something like that, some administrative HR kind of thing package. He came in. Now, you have to remember, everybody that was working for me, I was the ripe old age of about 28, 29 at that point. Everybody that worked for me was no older than 22 or 23. And there were some that were as young as 17 or 18. Okay. Bob came in. There is a mature person, I thought. The first time I saw him, there's a solid guy. There's a guy that I can trust to do the right thing, that's reliable, that can be as steady as a rock. And all those things turned out to be true. Absolutely true. Bob Smith is really one of the unheralded veterans of that whole business. Even his name works against him. That there's actually Bob Smith societies. There's literally millions of Bob Smiths in this world. I always thought the name was a real kind of an anchor in a way, it's just, because who's going to remember Bob Smith? It's just too generic of a name.
It's no good when you're trying to find Bob Smith to interview him, I'll tell you.
There's a challenge for you. I still talk to Bob about, he's literally one of my oldest friends. I talk to him probably once a month. Matter of fact, I'm about due to call him, sometime this next few days. all those things that I thought I saw in him in terms of reliability, steadfastness, what's the word? Kept his word. He did what he said he was going to do. He wasn't a rabble rouser, although he had his own opinions and things about things later, but he wasn't a rabble rouser kind of person. He didn't have the impetuousness of youth. I could tell that right away, or necessarily the idealism of youth even, although, we all did a little bit, of course. So that is the real reason I think I made Bob Smith an offer. He was also, of course, at that time dirt cheap because he was making a fraction of what many of the other people that came in for interviewing were. I mean, you can imagine working at a lumber company in Southern Oregon, they weren't paying a lot, and but he came in and the guy was amazing. I mean, he's amazing. He's a stalwart. I mean, he stayed on in Magic after I left. He was the head of the department there for a long time. Kind of saw Magic down to the bitter end, literally. He's a stalwart. I really have a lot of respect for Bob, and he's a good guy, really good guy. So, but I will tell you one other quick story about Bob Smith, if you're interested. One time we went to a brainstorming session. We kind of inherited from Atari days, Atari coin-op days. We did the same thing in a Magic. We went down to, I believe it was Pajaro Dunes or Monterey Dunes down in, south of Santa Cruz. And, you stay in these little beach condos and you go for walks on the beach and you have brainstorming sessions and all that sort of thing. And I remember walking on the beach and Bob was next to me along with the other people there. And I remember saying to Bob at the time, I said, Bob, you really should savor this moment. He said, yeah, Dennis, he says, I really do. And, and I said, well, it's probably never going to get any better than this, right this instant. And Bob says, I think you're right, Dennis. And sure enough, that was probably the best it ever was, back in those days. I mean, we were at our peak and Atari was doing well and we were, coattailing them and it was just a good time to be in the games business at that point in time, and little do you know, you don't remember those kinds of statements unless things happen later that cause you to remember those kinds of statements, really, I think is what it comes down to when everything kind of went to hell later and everything contracted and things started changing and all that sort of stuff. So you look back and you say, oh man, that really was a defining moment. You can't always say that about things, but it is the case that you can sometimes point to a whole series of events or a certain point in time. It's just like the recollections of a lot of Atari employees that I'm sure that it's given you. You look back and you say, wow, that was really good. I didn't realize how good it was at the time. And that's exactly kind of how I feel, although I think I did realize how good it was at the time, but it was relatively short-lived. All this was compressed. We talk about it like it spanned years, but in reality, it was a couple, 3 years, but it was not a huge length of time in a person's life, necessarily. But it was obviously a very influential time in a person's life. And I can honestly say, I think that all my contemporaries and myself and everybody else, we all contributed to the birth of a new industry, a new way of thinking, a new something that is still expanding today. The games. I mean, it's extraordinary when you see these graphics, and I don't know if you play MMORPGs yourself. You certainly have seen them, obviously, but I play them all on PC. I don't have a gaming console. I've always been a PC person. They are extraordinary compared to what we used to do. I mean, the graphics, the sound, everything about them. People used to lament, and I know they still do at these classic gaming things, how lament that a lot of these games just aren't as fun as the old ones. Well, I would respectfully disagree. There's way more games today, and certainly a lot of them aren't very much fun. But the fact of the matter is the cream of the crop today is, in my opinion, every bit as fun as the cream of the crop back in those days. It's different. Mm-hmm. It's a much richer experience in a lot of ways, but your imagination is a powerful tool. Back in those days, we used a lot of imagination and a little bit of technology. Today, you probably don't have quite as much imagination, but the technology tends to make up for it in a lot of ways, So just my opinion.
Sure. On the other, do you think there's something that has been lost, or is it okay that today a game can be great, but it takes a team of dozens or hundreds of people to create it. And back in the day, one guy could create Atlantis, and it was wonderful.
Yes. Well, it does concern me a bit. I mean, you're asking, in a sense, the wrong person, because you're going to find, just from our prior interview here today, that I'm going to be the person who's going to lean toward the smaller groups. When we started working, Lee and I started working as, in Polygames, Sterling Silver Software originally, and we changed it to Polygames later. We worked for EA for quite a number of the hits that we did, and also for Sega. We did one of the Sonic titles and things like that along the time, and we did a ton of other stuff too. But we worked for EA, and already by that point, by the time we left EA, it literally, when you say dozens, it's actually more like hundreds these days, I'm convinced, because it was when we left even a few years ago. There's at least 150 to 250 people working on any AAA title these days. I guarantee you there are. There's just so much that has to go into it. There's so much art, so much music, so much technology, blah, 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 all those things, that you know about. And you just can't even imagine. Lee and I were an anomaly, really. We were among the very last of the very small groups that were out there. And for a number of years, 3 years, we were the hired guns. We were the guys that you brought in when you were going to miss a deadline. Sonic 3 wasn't ready for Christmas that year. What are they going to do? It was a major potential disaster for Sega. I mean, serious, major disaster. Could have put the company out of business. So we were the guys. We were super expensive. They brought us in. They paired us with a couple of other guys, a designer who was absolutely first rate and went on to found his own company later, and it's very successful these days. And we came up with Sonic Spinball, which was a stopgap product. And we did the whole thing in literally something like 2.5, 3 months. It was insane. I mean, we were literally working. I mean, you hear those phrases, I work 24 hours a day. And of course, you always kind of qualify that a little bit. But the fact is that we did put in 16 to 20-hour days. My phone bill, now this is back before phones were free. Phone calls were free, you have to understand. My phone bill, my ear got so sore being on the phone, in addition to programming at the same time, that 1 month I remember, now this may not impress you, but you have to remember this is back when phone bills were $20 or $30 at most. Right. I got one phone bill 1 month, it was like $320. Which is extraordinary. I mean, it basically meant I had been on the phone for like 57 hours or some ridiculous number like that. It was insane. I remember thinking at the time, I'm never going to do this again. It was just too intense, But we were the last two guys, Lee and I. We never really hired anybody other than some subcontractors at times to do art for us and stuff. But we were the last two guys that did that sort of thing. And I would dare say that it's virtually impossible to do that today. So you might get away with it. Well, I was going to say 3 or 4 years ago, you could have got away with it with a cell phone game or something, but you can't even do that anymore. The cell phone games are incredibly sophisticated as the hardware has increased in its power, and its ability. So yeah, it was kind of a difference. So I would tend to agree with you in one sense that today you're more a cog in the machine. You really are. Your ability to influence the game, to add your own personal touch to it, by necessity is much more limited than it was back in the older days. Why? Because, well, it's not just merely the fact that you're one of 150 or 200 people, but the fact is that major financial incomes are riding riding on the success of your product. It is scripted in intense detail, all from top down, and it doesn't really, I think, allow for a lot of individual creativity. There's people that are better than other people at doing something, in some sub aspect of the game. And you can see that in the better games and stuff. But, you don't have any sort of, hired guns or wild cards, putting their own little 2 cents into the game. I mean, you just don't see that these days, So yeah, I would tend to agree with that statement. I think it's better than when it was smaller and stuff, I wouldn't be comfortable today working for a games company. It got to the point where I would go into EA, especially near the end of our tenure, and there was just hundreds of people just as in engineering, just in the programming groups. And they were I didn't know them. I mean, I'm sure they were all doing valuable stuff and everything, but they were just, it was not like the old days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turned into old geezer, let's face it. That's really what it comes down. Back in my day, by cracky.
All right. I think this is my last question.
Okay.
This podcast is listened to by people who still use their Atari computers. Some of them are playing games. Some of them are programming. Some of them are creating new hardware. Mm-hmm. So if you could send a message to those people, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, I think it's important. One of the things that I have found out that my hobby over the years, which was playing games, was also my avocation and eventually became my career. And I find that here I am, quote, retired, but I still play games, So I think it's good to have some sort of stream, or stream's the wrong word, deep interest in something. Some people call it a hobby, some people call it their job or, their career or whatever. But I think it's important. I mean, I've always been a goal-oriented person. And I think that if I had to say, I think the goal-oriented people are probably overall a little happier and a little more satisfied with life because they've got, I would say my biggest problem these days with being retired is that there's no need for me to finish what I'm working on by Christmas. So I can easily get distracted, which I do. And I don't, if there's no external impetus or some sort of goal in mind, I don't do really well. I need to I'm a goal-oriented person, so I've got to be goals. And so I would put that right in there. The people that are still on those computers, still making hardware, still fascinating them, uncovering every secret that exists, extending them, all that sort of stuff. I think that's great. I mean, I think it's important to have that sort of thing, at least for a person like myself. And I suspect a lot of these people are very goal-oriented. It's can be financially very gratifying. I mean, I was fortunate to be around at the beginning. And so usually the people that are at the beginning of things tend to do pretty well. Later it's when all the Johnny-come-latelys and the Me Toos that come that it tends to get diluted, down the line. But there's still room for a lot of creativity and a lot of satisfaction, and it is very satisfying when somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I did this, I played this, or I used your, Lee we'd go to these shows and Lee would get as many people coming up to him congratulating him on his advanced music system for the Atari 400-800 as did his games. And I'm sure there's people to this day that are using the advanced music system or some variant of it. It's very gratifying, to know that that somebody cared about what you did. And it's not so much about the money. The money's nice, it's an ancillary thing, but it's more of a validation than anything. But I think that it's much better for you to say to me, Dennis, I love this game. It was my passion and I still play it or whatever, than if it would be for you to send me $10 or $20. Honestly, it's worth way more for you to say, oh, I love that game. I loved what you were working on. Or, oh, man, you know so much about the 400-800 to some of these guys. And, you solved my problem that had been plaguing me or gave me some, that's satisfying. That's worth, in my opinion, more so than money. Now, money's very necessary, don't get me wrong, but it, and it was financially rewarding for me over the years, as it was for Lee and everything. And a lot of those people actually did pretty well. But I think, honestly, it's kind of like that old thing. Do you ever wonder why you see these old geezer rock musicians out there going on tour or playing dates? And I used to wonder that. I say, well, what could possibly be their motivation? Well, their answer, of course, is they want people to clap. They want them to cheer. They want them to say, oh, man, I love that song you did. I just, it was the best thing. I've learned how to play it on my own guitar or whatever it is, and I can sing it and everything. That's way more gratifying than getting the money for it. Trust me about that one. Absolutely true. So, yeah, that's the word I would give to the people is follow your dreams and your interests. That's a time-worn phrase, but there's a lot of truth to it. So,
awesome, good answer. Thank you, Dennis.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to meet you. Hopefully I'll see you at the show maybe this year.
Yeah, I will be there this year for sure.
Okay. That'd be great.
Excellent. Thank you. And what's the cat's name?
Well, there's several of them, but this one's Curry. I don't know if you can see her in the picture.
Not right now, but she was there.
She's a calico female, and she's absolutely devoted to me. So much so that it's a little tedious at times. But we've got another one around here, a little black cat called Cricket that is a little terror actually.
I think Cricket's sleeping behind you on the desk behind you, the other way. Is that a cat or?
That's a laptop bag. Oh. It looks just like her. One thing I honestly have to tell you, one thing I never had a black cat my whole life. We've had cats my whole life.
Yeah.
I never had a black cat until this Cricket came along. One of the things I noticed is it's very hard to see the features on a black cat. All you see is black.
Yeah.
You don't see the head and the nose shape and all the other little, identifying marks. It's just a black shape, So, and that's really contrasted to every other kind of cat. You can see their expression, you can see their, all the other identifying markings, but not a black cat. So it's kind of interesting. So as you can tell, I'm obsessed with obscure facts. Also,
my cat's been trying to break into my office for the last hour and a half, so I'm going to let him in now.
Yeah, we get that too a lot, Yeah. So, well, again, it's a pleasure meeting you. Actually,
thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I'll let you know when this is published. It won't be until sometime next month. So.
Yeah, send me a link to your. I think you did already, actually, to your blog site and stuff like that. I just haven't clicked on it yet.
Yeah,
but if you haven't, go ahead and do that.
Sure.
I'll check it out for sure.
All right.
See who else you've got out there. Probably a lot of people I know, I would imagine.
Yes, you said a lot of names of people I've talked to, and a few that I haven't. So my current thing that I'm working on right now, I don't know, you probably weren't there for this, but in 1982, 1983, Atari did this weird thing called the Youth Advisory Board, where they got 20 kids between the ages of 13 and 17 and brought them to Sunnyvale and took them to meetings and gave them all computers. So I'm finding as many of those kids as I can and interviewing them.
Well, that in a similar theme, Imagic had this big contest for Atlantis. So maybe you remember, maybe you don't. But they had the World Finals were going to be held in Bermuda, and I had been to Bermuda before, and but I was given the royal treatment. They put me first class on the plane, and they flew me to Bermuda, and there was this giant contest, and I got to meet several of the guys. Oh my God, they were so good. They were younger than me considerably at that time, but they could play. They could literally play the game for as long as the power, held out. I mean, it was amazing how adept they were at this game. And I always wondered about some of them because I remember one of them is actually a friend of mine on Facebook. As a kid, he was a kid. He literally a kid, like a 10-year-old kid at the time. His name's Rawson Stovall. He was a video game kid.
I interviewed him.
Oh, did you? Yeah. Okay, yeah, Rawson. Yeah, he grew up to be a fine young man, I guess. He doesn't post much on Facebook, and again, but I went on a nationwide tour with him and a couple other people, and we did radio spots across the nation and TV interviews and all sorts of stuff, promoting Imagic and the video games thing and Atlantis and all those kinds of things. And Rawson was he was a big gamer at the time, and so it was kind of, fun for him too, I think, but it's fun. Every so often I think about people like that Facebook has been a wonderful tool to keep in touch with some of them, in later life, but a lot of people don't post a lot on Facebook, and like I'm one of them. And so you don't really feel like you know them the way they are currently, you kind of have memories of them.
Sure.
I was very, very surprised, for instance, one little final note. I don't know why, but I've come to this theory that if you know a person that you have memories of during some period of your life, the instant that you no longer associate with them for whatever reason, they freeze in your memory. They never age. They never change. And if by some chance later in life you run across them or some news of them or a photo of them, and the one that kind of blew me away, and I just wasn't aware of it, was the recent demise of Ray Kassar. Ray Kassar wasn't a friend of mine by any means, but I knew him and interacted with him. It was a shock to me, I have to tell you. wait a minute, Ray Kassar died? How could he die? He was frozen in time. He was relatively, he was in his mid-50s or maybe early 60s, whatever it was, when I was the manager there.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Is what's going through your brain, So it's interesting. As I've gotten older, I've started to spend more time noticing how the various aspects of human nature and how our brains work and things. That's all very interesting to me these days. I'm interested in that and history increasingly. And it's amazing how, you just can't, human beings are, we're kind of all the same. Of course, everyone's an individual, but we kind of have a common human experience. And, and that human experience includes how our brains work and how memory works and all those kinds of things. And I think it's pretty interesting, though. But yeah, I do think about certain people from the past like that, especially in the video games business, in the computer business, Atari business, all that sort of stuff in the past. And I wonder in some cases what happened. Some of them I've never been able to contact or have never seen again. I don't know where they are. Did they die? Who knows?
Yeah.
Don't really know. So it's interesting, though. So, okay, Kevin, I'll let you go.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, it's fun talking to you.
Good talking to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.